people who could help. And so, yeah, it's just a free forum to exchange ideas around a selected theme. Right. So let's begin. As you all might already know, Kamala Mukunda, the author of the book, will join us at 5. Before that, we can quickly discuss the key ideas presented in the book. So the book is actually in 2 parts. Will, I think, because of the time constraint, discuss only the first part of the book, maybe a little bit of the second part. And it's about theory, right, as the name suggests. So the whole book addresses 2 main questions. One is what does the research say about different aspects of learning, and what can we as educators, how can we as educators co-opt these findings to make learners learning a little better, right? So even in today's meeting, what we'll do is we'll have a look at some key takeaways and then stop, reflect, discuss each other's experiences and so on. So, of course, the book is focuses on many aspects. We'll try to focus on some of the aspects today, the aspects of different aspects of learning, some aspects of early childhood development, motivation, intelligence, testing, and so on. Okay, so let's get going. This is going to be an interactive session. We'll try to keep the interaction to the chat as much as possible. If there's something that's too pressing that you would like to share, you can unmute and share. Right. So let's start with looking at learning. So what I would like you all to do is, there's a picture here, right? So maybe think of what kind of story comes in your mind. What could be happening here in this picture? Just take a minute to think about it and start sharing in the chat box. Okay. Padma has already shared. We'll wait and okay. Okay, so already a few people have responded, and the responses are very different. So someone is saying that it looks like the person is teaching to dive. Someone is saying that the person is threatening. Someone is saying it's about learning, water, marine life, fishing. They want to swim and they might have drowned, so threatening. Okay. Story session in progress. Looks like he's narrating some story. Okay, he's maybe warning that you should not go in water. He's advising children. Let's just wait for 2 more minutes and see if, okay. Shailaja says importance of school rather than in the school. Okay, the man is telling something about marine life, but the boys do not look very enthusiastic about it. Okay. Right. Interesting. So as you already noticed that all of us looked at the picture in different ways. Someone looked at it, someone thought it was threatening, someone thought it was advice, someone thought from the perspective of the narrator, someone thought from the perspective of the children. Someone also thought about the marine life, the ocean that's there in the background and so on, right? So does it tell us about the learning process as such? Does this experience tell us about the learning process? The fact that just the same picture gave so many diverse stories from all of us, does that tell anything about the process of learning?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Yeah, so this was just a simple picture, right? But everyone looked at it in many different ways, and all of us came up with slightly different stories to tell about the picture. What does this experience tell us about learning. Okay, Tarun says, we learn in different ways, listening, experiencing, reflecting, so on. Learning is personal, Vindhya says. Right. So this is one of the key ideas presented in the book, one of the initial key ideas presented in the book. And all of you might be aware of this in the form of constructivism or constructivist approach, right? So what happens is learners all the time construct knowledge, and the construction does not happen in vacuum. It happens based on our prior experiences, our likings, dislikes, what we know about the world or how we see the world, and so on. So the first principle that she talks about in terms of learning is how knowledge is constructed, and it's constructed based on the prior experiences. Next key idea, which again all of you might be aware because of Piaget, which is presented by Piaget, is that knowledge is not just individual lines or ideas, but knowledge is organized in our brain in the form of chunks called schemas. And there are different types of knowledge. It could be procedural, conceptual, and so on. And generally, when new knowledge is created, it is on top of prior knowledge or prior understanding. And it is either through adaptation, it is either accommodated or assimilated. So assimilated is it just fits into my prior understanding. It just adds more branches. And in accommodation is it somehow changes my original schema and creates a new schema. So there's a phase of equilibrium. There's a central phase of disequilibrium where I'm not getting what this new thing is and how it is fitting with my prior knowledge. And it gives rise to the final state of, again, equilibrium, which is a new knowledge. Right. Now, looking at what is talked about learning or science of learning, a question for all the teachers here: do we use this understanding when we teach? Do we use this understanding of, okay, so if you're saying yes, maybe you can give a quick example. If you're saying no, again, you can give a quick example. Okay, yes and no is a good answer. Not really. Okay, fine. So whatever you're saying, you can quickly give a example if you can think of. We use provocations before we start any unit. This is the example of yes, I think, Padma. Okay, so can you elaborate a bit further? Yeah, in the meantime, if others can also share. Geetanjali, you say not really. Someone else also said no. And yes, so a few more examples maybe.
Do you want me to type, or typing is going to take a little time?
Yeah, you can unmute and speak. That's fine.
Yeah, so we generally, like you said, generally experiences that you have had is what you start connecting with. So I think initially, before launching anything, I think you need to make connections to what is the concept, or what is the big umbrella. So pictures are very good ways to start a provocation. Like you showed a picture, and it brought in so many perspectives, and the way we connect, the connections that we make gives a very good understanding of what we have, what is the prior experience of a learner, or of the person who is connecting the picture to. So that gives a very good way into further inquiry into a topic. So
Okay.
this particular picture is a beautiful provocation for literacy. It could be a fiction writing, it could be a non-fiction writing, it could be science, social studies, so many things.
Right. Yeah. So yes, that's one good example. Maybe people who said no, I would love to hear from them. Any examples or any reason you said no? You can unmute yourself. That's fine. Okay, so Tarun is saying that if we directly teach without knowing what they know, then we are not using the knowledge. But otherwise, if we try to elicit the prior knowledge, then we are. Okay, so eliciting is one part. What about schemas? Do we use schemas somewhere? So this is how knowledge is built in our brain, and I think we'll talk a bit more in the later slides. So any thoughts on, do we use the idea of schemas? Okay, Pragyati, sometimes we are not mindfully connecting with prior experiences when we are more focused on covering the syllabus. Right. Yeah, the constraints of syllabus are true, and this might happen, especially in the schools that we have around. We have the constraint of covering the syllabus and all. Yeah. Any thoughts about schemas? So schemas are nothing but packets of knowledge, chunks of knowledge in the form of connections that are formed in our brain. Okay, so let's take one example. Say some students say that multiplication always results in larger numbers. First, if you can all say if it's true or false, and then we'll discuss more. This is not a test, just an observation. Some students believe or share with you that multiplication will always result in larger numbers. Okay, so some teachers are saying not necessarily. We'll wait for a few more minutes. Okay, a lot of teachers are saying not always. So, but this is what we realize from our classroom, that there's an imaginary classroom, and I realize that students believe that multiplication results in larger numbers. What can I do? Using the knowledge of schema and constructivism and so on, what can I do to sort this? Any thoughts? Okay, Kanika already gave an example, I guess, until it's not multiplied by 0. So that's one example, that if I multiply by 0, it is not going to form a larger number. That's a great example, Kanika. Any other examples? So basically, I could just present this as a counter example and show that this might not always be true. Any other examples which does not fit this statement? So Kanika has revised the statement saying that it's true only if it is multiplied by a non-zero number. Is that true? Okay, so Tarun has said decimals. Right. I think Pragya also is talking about decimals. Yeah, so these are all counter examples, right? Let's say some other number, because we are talking about decimals. Say more digit is always equal to a bigger number. So this is the belief. First, you all say, tell me if this is true or not. And if you think it's not true, then how can we go about, sorting this issue in a classroom? Okay, again, not necessarily. Then what do I do? What kind of example could fit, what kind of example does not fit this statement? So Pragya, since you said no, maybe you can give an example. Okay, sure. Yeah, when multiplied by a decimal number. Right. So what is this telling us? What is the general idea here? So we took the prior knowledge. The prior knowledge that I understood from the classroom was multiplication results in larger numbers. To sort out the issue of converting this prior knowledge to a new knowledge, I could just give more and more counter examples which does not fit. And as you might have realized, every time I give a counter example, the statement can be revised a little more. And then with another counter example, again, it could be revised a little more and so on. So it's not like a one-step event. It's a multi-step process. Like Kanika said that a non-zero number, someone talked about decimals, someone talked about fractions and so on. Someone also talked about, I think Darun then again said that not every decimal number multiplication will be a larger or smaller. So again, every statement can come up with more and more counter statements, and through such dialogue and discussion between statements and counter statements, new knowledge can be constructed. So this is what the simple thing that Kamla is trying to say. And what is very interesting about the book is that it comes with a lot of evidence presented through research that there are different classes taught in different ways and what kind of students learn better and so on, right? So yes, this was one way. Any other ways that we can use the process of learning that we just saw in order to create higher conceptual understanding? Yeah, so Pragya says examine carefully and weigh against existing knowledge. Pragya, would you like to unmute? I didn't clearly get what you're trying to say.
I was talking about your previous point that if there is a statement given, we have to examine it critically and weigh it against what we already know and see whether it is true or not true. And if our evaluation turns out to be wrong, then we learn something new.
Right. So we is who here? We is the facilitators or we are the learners? So it could be both, right? So we as facilitators will be getting new and new knowledge about how my learners are learning. And by this dialogue, learners will automatically create new knowledge, right? So this was the example for math. Let's take an example for, say, language. Any ideas how can we bring out higher conceptual understanding in language? Or history, say, or science? Any thoughts from anyone? Okay, I'll just present some ideas. Okay, daily life examples. Reena is saying connecting to daily life, I guess. Okay, word wall to create new vocabulary. Give different words and let them classify. Okay, classify how, Tarun?
Yeah, for example, let's say if we give them different words, for example, name of few places, name of few people, some he, she, some verbs, running, and ask them to classify. We may figure out they may classify in multiple ways. We may expect them that they may classify based on the noun, pronoun, verbs, and all, but they may classify based on the number of letters used, right? That can also be another classification. So we may get they may get an opportunity to do that, as well as when they are classifying, if they are putting one word, let's say noun, they are putting in verb, and if we ask them that why are they putting, and if they are giving justifiable reason, then that's great. But if we think that they are not thinking in the right direction, then probably again we are getting that opportunity to give them further thoughts, ask question, or reflect on this, and so on. Take it further.
Sorry. Yeah, so that's great, Tarun. In the meantime, I also read some messages in the chat. Some people are talking about word wall or password of the day. these are vocabulary building activities, be a little more interactive. But do you all agree that they would lead to higher conceptual understanding? So memory is a slightly different aspects. Conceptual understanding is slightly different aspect. We'll come to memory a little later. These could be ideas to make quick tools for increasing the vocabulary and so on, right? Right. So practice books, it is effective in senior level. Okay, so practice books is repeating some kind of problems again and again. So, right. So I'll share some of the ideas which are presented in the book. One is understanding the wrong answer, which the example which we just saw, that where is the wrong answer coming from. Some other possibilities are asking questions, right? So sometimes we ask questions like what are rational numbers, or what is a noun, what are vowels, and so on, right? But can we ask questions like how questions, or asking what's Chandeep is saying? Can someone mute? There's some background coming. Open-ended questions, Chandeep is saying. Yeah, why questions are powerful, Padma says. So why or how questions? So sometimes it might feel that, coming to just sharing from my personal experience here, that it's not that we even need to come to the answer of why or how question. That if that happens, that's great. But even the process of finding the answer of why and how itself creates learning. So it's one need not be bothered about these. This seems like a very complicated task for a child and so on, because even the process of finding out answers could be powerful. It's just from my personal experience. If there's some other thoughts, okay, discussion, right? This is something very interesting which I found in the book in language. So maybe you yourself write a first draft and then convert it to a final draft by making some edits, and then give both the drafts for the children to find out what were the differences in the two drafts. This could be your own writing sample, or it could be some author's sample, it could be some senior student sample or anything. But just finding differences in the first draft versus final draft could be a great learning opportunity. And I really like that idea. Would love to hear from other language teachers if anybody have used this strategy or some similar strategy. Other thing is encouraging multiple ways of solving the same problem. So this could be especially useful in math if you have arrived at an answer, or science, or yeah, at least I can think in terms of math and science. If you've arrived at some solution, can we use some other ways to arrive at the same solution? Or in case of history, can we present different versions of the same event? Ask students to find patterns in different events and say, if there is there something like history repeats itself, or let them come up with theories, and then let them match their theories with what is presented in the book, and does it match, does it not match, and so on. Yes, and this is something that Padma just shared, right? Encourage students to talk, describe, explain, engage in any way, but more open-ended discussions. So these were some ideas which I found really interesting, which are present in the book. Anything else? Any other strategies that anybody have used, or have used these and haven't worked for you? Would love to hear from teachers. Any thoughts about this? Okay, yes, Tarun says prediction. I think prediction is also a great idea. Using previous knowledge, Reena is saying, right? So a lot of times, so every idea has been elaborated in great detail in the book. For example, when it comes to wrong answer, a lot of times we discard wrong answer as just a wrong answer because it's the wrong answer, but not discarding it and using it as a starting point is the idea that is presented, which I really like. Multiple answers, Tarun is saying. Yeah, so not looking for one particular answer, but multiple possibilities as answers. Right. Any experiences of using, Padma has said that she has used thinking routines. Yeah.
So just give me a moment. I think I might break.
Sure. Yeah. In the meantime,
So there are a lot of
sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there are a lot of thinking routines that one can use.
Mhm.
A simple thinking routine is the See, Think, Wonder, which is, like the picture that you showed.
Yeah.
What do you see? What do you think? And what do you wonder? So the wonder questions actually drive a lot of deep thinking, a lot of inquiry. So that is a very good thinking routine that I use plenty.
True. Yeah. So
And there are other thinking routines as well.
yeah, I agree. Yes, thinking routines are also a great tool for bringing higher conceptual understandings. For people who don't know about thinking routines, there's a lot of literature available. You can just quickly look up, and there are many simple activities that you can implement in your classrooms. Right. So, a quick thought. This seems to be a science classroom. What are your thoughts about this classroom? Not what is happening, but do you like this classroom? Why not, and so on. What can you tell just from this picture?
I think this classroom gives a lot of freedom to the students to explore and experiment. Thus, a lot of hypothesization can happen here, and lot more learning will happen here.
Okay, so that's what Padma is saying. Let's see what others are saying. Reena says learning by doing, children will enjoy. Someone is saying maybe comparing. Yes, sure, Geetanjali.
I just love it because it involves experiential learning.
Okay, so any more elaboration? Why do you think? I mean, why do you like it? Yes, I can see a lot of people are saying experiencing learning. Any more? Yeah, if you can elaborate a little more. Why do you like it as a classroom?
First, because first they stumble upon the wrong answers, not wrong hypothesis. Then they will slowly find out the right one.
Okay, so this we don't know what is happening, right? We are just having this picture in front of us where
Yeah.
students are doing something with the balloon and the bottle. So yeah, so Leena says it's an hands-on activity. So just looking at this picture, what all can you tell? Do you like this or do you not like it? Or what are the things that you would like to be there to make sure that it's a
Can I
activity?
say something?
Yeah, sure, Pragya.
Yeah, so if you look at this picture, if you show it to kids, the kids might be starting to think that why the balloon is getting inflated. What is there inside the bottle which is making it inflated? Because on its own, it may not happen.
Right.
And the second thing is that when you give this kind of activity to do, there are many things that we can't describe in words always. But when the children do it, they learn more because the nature is richer than what we can teach in the class.
Right. So you talked about two things, very interesting. One was just presenting this as a picture to the class and let children wonder what is happening. Second is let children just do this activity. You give them the protocol and the children follow and see that the balloon is blowing. Would you still like the classroom? Leena says hands-on activity. Parul says not starring as a facilitator. I did not get Parul. If you can unmute it, would be good.
Yeah, I mean to say that, they are not like a typical classroom. There is no blackboard and, nobody is just looking at one teacher and, learning thing. So that's the great thing I feel is there in this picture.
Okay, so a lot of good things are coming out. Looks like students are doing some experiments. That's one given thing. There doesn't seem to be a class blackboard nearby where someone is instructing on the blackboard and they're doing. So that's definitely other thing. It seems like they're exploring on their own. There is not much facility.
And also they are learning from each other.
Okay, they are learning.
Children are looking at
I
each
think
other.
that's comparing. Maybe it looks like they're comparing the size of their balloons. So these are just our interpretations. But all these ideas could be great ideas to have in science classrooms, right? But so I just wanted to make a small point here that this could be a great activity when all these things are happening. But if it was just a balloon blowing activity using the materials, then it would be just a hands-on activity. And this is the point that comes across in the book very strongly, that just a hands-on activity might not create learning as one would desire, right? Unless there are other things that we all talked about, learning might not happen, or the desired learning might not happen. Right, so this was a little bit about conceptual understanding or conceptual skills. What about procedural skills? What are your thoughts on procedural skills? Can we just come up with examples of some procedural skills? Niharika says self-learn, right? So yeah, I'm assuming it's about the last picture. Yeah, so this was what was about conceptual understanding. Can we give some examples of procedural skills? Do we use procedural skills? Okay, Tarun, bicycle riding. Long division, Ashwin is saying yes, classic procedural skill. Any other examples?
I just recall some experiment I did in kindergarten. I don't know whether it is procedural or not. It is about the safety rules, fire safety. While teaching fire safety, it's not we cannot show the fire, real fire, and how to blow it off, how to put out the fire. So instead of that, I lit a candle, and on that I put a glass.
Okay.
Glass. So because of lack of oxygen, the candle, the light has.
Yeah, fire went off. Right. Okay, so in the meantime, there are other things in the chat.
I told, really showed them, showed them the video of when you catch, whenever while you are cooking or your mother is cooking in the kitchen, when the utensil catches fire, you can put a bigger lid or a big utensil on that, so that because of lack of oxygen, you can put out the fire.
Okay, so yeah, this could be a procedural skill to make sure how to deal with fires, right? So
Yeah.
that's a procedural skill, I guess. Arranging how to order things in sequence is what someone is saying. How to fill income tax challenge? Yes, definitely. Drawing is drawing a procedural skill. Interesting thought. What do others think? Okay, graphic organizers. Okay, so experiments are a procedural skill. This is a very interesting point. Some of you have talked about cooking and experiments. Kanika talks about leaf imprinting and so on. Are these procedural skills? Do you all agree or disagree? Okay, Vindhya says depends on what is being drawn. Vindhya, would you like to elaborate a bit? So I think Vindhya is talking about drawing. Depends on what you're drawing. It will determine if it's procedural or not. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Are science experiments procedural skills? Okay. Biology or physics drawing would be procedural, is what Vindhya is saying. Interesting point. Because you have to follow the particular procedure and steps to complete that drawing is what is the understanding, I think. Okay, if they learn one drawing and they keep drawing the same thing again and again to become better at it, then it's procedural. Okay, interesting thought. But is that how you learn to draw? I draw a leaf and then keep drawing leaf again and again to become a better artist. Yeah, just a question for everyone to wonder. So same about experiments or science drawings. We keep doing again and again, but there's something that is coming from everyone, that procedural skills are skills that if you want to get better at, you need to repeat them again and again, right? Same about cycling. So if I have to be a cyclist, or if I have to be better at cycling, I have to practice cycling. That's how I'll get better at the skill of cycling. Okay, so that's an interesting thought. We'll
I have one more.
wait a little bit. Yeah. Sure, Geetanjali.
When I was in 8th grade, my physics teacher showed an experiment that is very simple. He mixed rinse soap with the surf, and the rinse soap is blue and the surf is yellow, and he got this red color.
Okay.
And what happened? Actually, blue and yellow gives some kind of greenish color.
Right.
But here he got red. So the experiment involves chemistry. So children may think what happened. So
right. Yeah, Geetanjali, you're right. This could be an interesting experiment to think about, but I'm not sure if it will classify as a procedural skill. But some aspect of it will. So again, an interesting point is coming out that it's very difficult to classify something as strictly procedural skill and strictly conceptual. For any learning to happen, both the aspect of procedural skill and conceptual skills should happen together simultaneously, and only then the holistic learning might happen. Reena is now talking about problem solving. Yes, it's definitely a skill which one might get better at by solving problems over and over. Same about skill like observation, hypothesizing, or any other skill. If you do it over and over, you might get better at it. Again, it depends on what you're doing. If I'm doing the same activity again and again, I'm not going to get better at it. But if I'm presented with different scenarios, I might get better at it. So there's a word here which I'm sure everyone is aware of, and there is a lot of debate around it, which is called drill. A lot of time Indian schools are talked about saying that there's a lot of drill in the school because that's what the main focus is. So any thoughts? So basically what we are saying is if you have to get better at procedural skill, you have to use drill as a way. So is drill good or bad then? We talked about many skills like cycling, problem solving, and so many other things. Or drawing, if you have to master any skill, you have to repeat it. So then is drill good or bad? That's the question that I'm asking everyone.
It's a very debatable conversation.
Okay, yes, I agree. But what is the thought then? Drill is necessary as it looks like, right? From our conversation so far. Okay, Reena says depends on the subject. But as we just discussed that it's very difficult to classify any subject as just conceptual and just procedural. A lot of times it's a complex mixture of both the things. If you are learning skills using drill, then that is better. Okay. Okay. Someone is saying it is good for primary classes. Okay. That's again a very debatable point. It helps in spellings or I would say mathematical tables and so on. Okay. So that's again very interesting point. Right. Any other thoughts? So what is the vote? Is drill good or bad? Some people are saying yes, maybe for primary. Maybe it depends on what you're doing. But then what are we doing?
Rinal, may I say? Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think in our age, when we studied, Drill worked, drill and rote memory, rote learning worked, but in this time and age, it doesn't work.
But we
And
just
there is no need of drill. Sorry.
We just talked that we need skills definitely in this. It's all about 21st century skills, right? And to master any skill, someone just told that to master any skill, you need drill. So then how are we saying that in this century, it's drill is not going to work? Okay, Pragya says drill is required for perfection. Right. So this again.
Drill
Yeah.
itself is so negative. It
Yeah.
has a negative connotation.
Right. Yeah.
So we need to replace it with a better word.
Yeah. So I guess it got the negative connotation because of a reason. So as long as we are aware of the negative connotation and using drill, I think it makes sense. So again, this is a very important part of the book. Kamala talks about drill a lot as in this distinction about drill and is it good to use in education, right? So there is a very important distinction here. Where are you using the drill for? So this balance between drill and learning for understanding. So we talked about a lot of things earlier about understanding, right? So is there a balance between your drill activities and learning for understanding? A lot of times when we say rote learning or drill, you're using you're making children to repeat the definitions and so on. That might not be a great idea for drill. But if you're presenting different situations and scenarios again and again, over and over to practice some skills, that might be a good idea to use drill, right? Yeah, so some quick summarization. For good learning or higher learning to happen, there needs to be a good balance between drill and activities which enhance learning for understanding. And learning is a combination of conceptual and procedural. It's, as some of you said, right? It depends on what you're learning. I don't think that's true. Whatever you're learning has the aspects of both conceptual and procedural. Some might have more of one and the other way around. Good drill are activities which are also fun, which happen in chunks. You don't have like hours and hours of drill. And there is a very interesting aspect that is talked about in the book, that there is a space to reflect on why some procedure is working, or if I'm following some procedure, why that procedure is working versus others and so on. So this reflection, even during drill, is a great idea, I feel. Again, any thoughts? Anybody have used some of these activities, or does it make sense? Yeah.
Mrinal, I'm pursuing B.Ed special education. So whenever I study, first I try to understand the concept and the procedure. Then I try to learn it, whether you call it drilling or rote learning or whatever it is. Only the drilling comes later. It is the last part.
Okay.
First, anybody, whether it's a child or an adult or anybody, first need to understand the concept. Otherwise, without this concept, procedure, understanding, just depending on mere drilling, it doesn't work.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Gitanjali. Someone is also sharing that it depends on different levels of achievements. So different types of drills for different levels of achievements. I think that's also a great thought. Thank you for sharing. There's also something about reasoning skills, which is the key for everything, as you would all agree. And all tests across the world, not just in India, have shown that post-school learning, the informal reasoning skills are abysmally low for all students. So what can we do about it is a question. Any thought? So just to clarify, what are informal reasoning skills, right? Formal reasoning skills are like, we have this reasoning based questions which are related to curriculum. You have to reason out things which are taught to you. Informal reasoning skills are skills like, say I ask a question, do video games lead to increased violence? And the answer need not be yes or no. So having a detailed dialogue or debate around, so having a nuanced discussion around any issue is based on evidences and logic and so on, is informal reasoning skill. So basically trying to reason out the real problems in the world and so on. So yeah, any ideas how can one go about this?
Say the question again.
Any ideas to develop the informal reasoning skills or reasoning skills in general? Okay, yes, Tarun says give them the opportunity to reason. Yes, that's a simple but great way. But reason what? Where? So yeah, I think because we are running slightly short of time, I would like to share this because it might miss out. This is a great strategy which again Kamala has shared in her book. It has been developed by some psychologist way back. It's called as reciprocal teaching. And what you have to do is, maybe some of teachers might have already used it, but what you have to do is, newspaper club discussions, right? So what you have to do is divide students in the group of 6 or 7 and and give them a slightly difficult write up to read. It could be from any subject, science, history, math, anything. And one student reads a paragraph, second student summarizes it, third student clarifies it if there are something which are not clear, or if you would like to make things clear and so on. The next student asks a question such that either the answer is answered in the text itself or it brings out some discussion based on the text. And the last step is again very interesting, is prediction, where you predict what could happen next in your text. So, and the cycle repeats. So I have tried this once in one of my classrooms and it worked wonderfully. So I would also encourage everyone to try it out. It's called as reciprocal teaching. You can find many references again around reciprocal teaching. Just today, I think Senta has shared a reference about reciprocal teaching. Reciprocal learning, think, pair, share. Okay, yeah, I get it. Right. So the one concluding statement that she has written, which was really profound, I thought, was, it happens that we underestimate our students' capacities to learn. Some teachers do this all the time, and all the teachers do it some of the time. So as long as we are aware that, we could underestimate and maybe really questioning our assumptions, that a lot of times we hear teachers saying that, our students can't do this, or maybe younger kids, primary school teachers would say, no, primary school students might not be able to do this, or senior students teachers would say, no, senior challenges are very different, they won't be able to do this would work in primary. Or the schools would say, no, in my school it won't work, in the other school it might work. So a lot of such things we hear very often, and I think it's quite human to come up with such things. But the most important thing is questioning our assumptions. Where are we coming to these conclusions from? Have we really tried it? Right. So we do underestimate our students, and there is no reason to do that. Collaborative learning is effective, definitely. I totally agree with you, Ajit. Right, so we hinted a bit on memory, and I think I'll skip this part because there are a lot of other interesting things later. Maybe if there's time, we can come back to this. Yeah, Ashwin, you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Mrinal. So, we've had a lot of discussion on teaching and different aspects of teaching. So we'll just play a quick game, you could say. So here on the screen, we have different country names which are jumbled. I would like you to take a minute and see if you can unscramble the country names. You can put your answers on chat. Right. So China and Iran, lots of people are able to get quickly. Okay. Yeah.
Third one is
Pragya,
Botswana.
yeah. Pragya, you got Botswana. Yes. Yeah. Geetanjali, yeah, you also got it.
Okay, China, Iran, Ashwin, somebody has written in the chat.
Yeah, many have got China and Iran. Yeah, Pragna, you got Singapore. Okay, nice. Right. So we
Fourth one,
have
I think Armenia.
Armenia. Can you check for the fourth one? You mean for the fifth one? There is no E, right? Yeah, Janvi, yes, you got Iran. Okay. Right. So Pragya, you were able to get Singapore. I think you're the first and the only person who has figured out the fourth one. And we still have two more words. Right. So someone's got the country for penalties, Palestine.
So China, Iran, Botswana, Singapore,
Yeah, for the fifth one.
Palestine.
Romania.
No, so you have to use all the letters. Romania is already part of it. Now we have that extra N and S.
Romanian.
Yeah, it has to be the name of a country. So Romanian would be like the person from Romania. Yeah, Romania is already part of this word. Now we have to add the extra letters N and S and make the name of a country.
Give up, give up.
Right. So yeah, Padma, you have given up already. But yeah, I'll just give a little bit of time.
Give a
so
clue, give a clue.
It's got two words.
It's got two words.
Yeah. Okay, right. So now I think I'll give the answer. Everyone's had a proper chance to try your hand at all these letters. So you've got all of the words except for the last one. And that Romanians, that is San Marino. So San Marino is a small, tiny municipality. It's located inside Italy, but it's also a sovereign country. Yeah, now next slide. Right. So, okay. I just wanted to give a quick summary about intelligence. So, this book by Kamala also talks about intelligence. And we now played a small game. We had an activity where we had to jumble the words that we are given. So before I explain the aspects of intelligence and so on, I would just like you to share what were the aspects, what skills did you use to solve this activity? You can just put your answer on chat, your response on chat. Right. So unfortunately, the dogs down the street, they were quiet all this time. They just chose to start barking now. Anyway, so my question for all of you is, we all played this game. We played this word game. Now, what skills did you use to figure out the answer for the previous activity? Right. So there was thinking, guessing. Yeah, that is of course involved. Memory. Yeah. Jumble. Yeah. Geographical. Yes. Okay. Permutation. Yes. Tarun. Yeah. Ruling out options. Guesswork and memorizing. Yeah. Nice. Long-term memory. Meaningful pattern. Yes. So now we used all these different aspects, but would you consider them as aspects of intelligence? So did we use intelligence, or would this game be a good measure of testing for intelligence? Right. So we had 6 words. I'm sure all of you were able to figure out at least 3 of them. And we all also struggled with one particular word that was with Romanians. So San Marino, we all struggled with. My question to all of you is, was that a good measure of intelligence? So we saw that we were using different skills, that is making patterns, using memory, and we also had our previous knowledge of geography. And we also ruled out certain letter combinations. So all of this is a part of intelligence, but it is not the whole of intelligence. So now, yeah, now you can just go to the next point.
Yeah, in the meantime, Kamla is also here. So hi, Kamla.
Hi, that's fine. Don't interrupt at all. I'll just be quietly listening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Right. So, yeah, in fact, this chapter on intelligence by Kamla just starts with this activity. That is, if you are asked to measure intelligence, what would be the tasks or questions you would ask someone to gauge intelligence? So now, of course, we haven't defined intelligence yet. That is still an open question. But would there be some kind of a general set of activities or questions that will measure intelligence in whatever way that you define? So you can share the tasks or the questions on chat. Right, so we can define intelligence in whatever way we choose to. But for your definition of intelligence, what would be the kind of question that you would ask? So for example, we had this word game we played. That would, you could say that would test someone's verbal intelligence. Now, is there, yeah. So here we were playing with words, and of course, we also had our knowledge of geography coming in and so on. So now, what would be the kind of questions or tasks that you could ask for intelligence? For example, solving a multiplication problem, would that constitute a measure of intelligence?
Geetanjali says EQ.
Yeah. Yes, EQ, I think that would refer to the emotional quotient. Yes, so that would definitely be an aspect. Yeah, we will also come to this discussion on how this emotional intelligence is also a part of intelligence. Yeah, we will come to that. Pragya says, yes, depends on how you define intelligence. Yes, so this is, of course, one of our key takeaways. That is, when we talk about intelligence, almost quickly we start talking about IQ, intelligence tests, and so on. But then before that, we will still have to consider the question of what we define by intelligence. And yeah, there is also this emotional aspect. Yeah, now we can go to the next point. Right. So this question, what does intelligence mean? It depends on how we define intelligence. That actually came up in the chat itself. Another question I wanted to ask was this. So while coming up with the activities, what were the assumptions that what were our assumptions when we came up with our measures of intelligence? For example, when I gave you the word game, I kind of had the implicit assumption that you can
one of the assumptions is mark one's knowledge.
Yeah, Geetanjali, can you repeat?
One of the assumptions is marks reflect one's knowledge.
Okay, right.
But
so
that's not true.
Right. One of the assumptions is that marks will reflect our knowledge. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a very good point, and that is something that will come up soon in our discussion. So, for example, one assumption that I made was all of you were comfortable with English. So I just shared English letters with you, and I kind of assumed that you will all be comfortable. And the second thing was I also had the assumption that you will know the names of these countries. So China and Iran, they were just having 4 letters and 5 letters, and which all of you almost all of you got. Yes, so the assumption that we all know the country names. Yes, that was one assumption. And the most difficult puzzle there was, of course, San Marino, which is not a very popular country. It's a very tiny country. Not everyone might be aware of it. And because people didn't get it, it would not it does not really mean that people are any less intelligent. It was something that highly was dependent on the knowledge that you should know that this country exists, and unless you knew it, unless you are familiar with it, it is going to be very difficult for you to crack.
And you also assume that a greater number of letters would pose greater difficulty, and that would excite everybody. That is what you also assume.
Yes, sure. That is also my assumption, and that was partially justified. Of course, not entirely. You, for example, quickly cracked Singapore. For example, when I played this game, I had difficulty getting Singapore because I thought the country name was going to end with an A, like Australia, Russia, or something. So this was an assumption on my part to solve, and that did not help me solve the problem. Anyway, what I'm driving at is this. We all have our assumptions on intelligence, and we also have these assumptions on the intelligence tests. What the intelligence tests actually measure would be like verbal ability, some spatial ability, or logical reasoning, and so on. But more or less, at least in the public imagination, IQ is, or the intelligence that we talk about, is only going to reflect about a specific ability, that is to perform well in schools. So whatever is the narrow range of intelligence that is applied in school or taught in school, that is what we mean by intelligence. So would you consider the ability to do well in school as intelligence?
Definitely not.
Okay. And if that is not if that does not capture the whole of intelligence, what other aspects of intelligence would you consider, for example?
There are a whole lot of other skills like communication skills, reasoning ability, collaborating with people. A whole lot of skills is required to kind of, and I think intelligence per se itself is very perspective.
Yeah,
so
right.
I want to know, what do you mean by ability to do well in school? First you have to tell us what do you mean by that, then we decide whether it is intelligence
right.
or not.
The one sentence answer would be the ability to do well in school is the ability to get more marks.
Then
As you said, if the ability to do get more marks in school is the intelligence, there won't be Bill Gates or Tom Cruise. They are also intelligent in their own way.
Yeah, true. Would anyone else like to add to that point?
Yeah, is there anyone who would like to contradict that? No, largely it does reflect, if you like, largely ability to do well in school does reflect intelligence. Is there anyone who would like to stand by that point? That's also fair point.
it may or it may not.
Okay. It may not.
Because getting high marks does not necessarily disqualify a person from being intelligent.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing your views. So this is, as educators, we will have this point. Yes, someone wants to say?
Interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's me, Geetanjali.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, sure. If you have something to share, you can go ahead.
Yeah, if the marks are the reflection of one's intelligence and ability to do well, but the very question is, but somewhere I came across that the very purpose of examination is memorizing, and it is putting it on how well you recall, and how well you put it on paper. So that is not intelligence. Did you get my point?
Yeah. So now it would be a question of how we conduct our exams, how we carry out our assessments. That is also part of the book. Unfortunately, we will not have the time to kind of go through that in detail, at least today. So at least in our kind of layman thinking, we have this kind of bias towards science and math, that someone's ability or someone's talent for science and math somehow reflects intelligence. This is unfortunate bias that most of us hold. Even as educators, unconsciously we might have this bias. So yeah, Mrinal, you can go to the next slide. So there are different ways of describing intelligence, and some psychologists have already come up with different definitions. So one was the idea of general intelligence. That is, there is this single idea of G, like general fund of mental energy. So someone who has a lot of this can use it in all aspects of their lives. So whatever puzzle that you give, whatever skills that you want to test, they can use this intelligence, they can push it in that direction, and they can exhibit intelligence. So whether it could be a matter of scoring marks or doing well in athletics, they could use this energy. So this idea was prevalent earlier. I think it was proposed by Spearman. Now, in at least in the recent times, there is this idea of multiple intelligences. It's put forward by Howard Gardner and Robert Sternberg. So they are psychologists. So Gardner, for example, he talks about 7 aspects of intelligence. They could be linguistic, musical, logical, and so on. So the linguistic or musical, for example, they will not be reflected in a subject like, say, math or science, but still they are part of intelligence. And it's not just this, it's also emotional skill, and it's also about even athletic ability. It comes under kinesthetic skills. So that also is a form of intelligence. Yeah,
And
just
you missed one thing in multiple intelligence. There is another intelligence that is naturalistic intelligence.
okay.
It's all about when the person get inspires from nature, and he could be able to whether the child is able to relate, could inspire from the nature, and naturalistic means he or she should be able to I mean.
Yeah, so Geetanjali, this is something new that I'm hearing from you, naturalistic intelligence. This is something I
Yes.
haven't come across before. Right. So at least Sternberg, he talks about the different aspects of intelligence as analytic, creative, and practical. Yeah. So the next slide will actually show the key takeaway. That is, would you consider someone's intelligence as fixed? There is this idea of having a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. So for someone who has a fixed mindset, who sees intelligence as something that is fixed, some people have it, some people don't have it, some people have more of it or less of it. Those people who have this fixed mindset, they are not motivated to learn as much as people who believe that intelligence is an incremental quantity, something that can be increased with practice or with more familiarity. So they are the people who have the, you could say, growth mindset, and these are the people who are motivated to learn. They are willing to face new challenges. They are open to new ideas and so on. So this is something that will this is going to determine how motivated a student is to learn. So of course there are different aspects of intelligence, and there is a whole part of how do we measure intelligence, of the utility of IQ tests and so on. But I think at this point we will stop because we have the author with us also, and I think we will have a better discussion through her also. So yeah, welcome Kamla to Teachers Corner.
Hi. Hello.
Yeah.
Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So a quick intro. Kamla, of course, has written 2 books. She has a PhD in psychology, and she's also a teacher at Center for Learning in Bangalore. So yeah, we can start asking whatever questions we have, either about the book or general experiences as an educator. She has been an educator for a really long time now. So yeah.
Right. So maybe we can ask the participants to share the questions on chat. We can moderate.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. So anyway, so I had this question, Kamla. In your book, at least in the second book, in the last chapter, you actually mentioned about the role of technology in education. And I really liked your phrase, that is, technology can supplement the teacher, but not supplant the teacher. But of course, this was written 2 years back. I think it was in 2019. And since then, we've had this COVID pandemic, and now the role of technology is a lot different. So my question to you would be like, what have your views changed since you last wrote the book?
Yeah, good question. No, in fact, it's become even more, it's confirmed all my views and feelings even more. Because here I have been put in a situation, not just me, but many, many fellow teachers across the world, put in a situation where we had to use technology. We are having to use it. So, perforce we've been made to test this theory that look, I'll tell you that the value of the technology doesn't exceed the value of the teacher. So I have to use it creatively. I have to reach out. I have to relate to them through this inadequate medium of a screen. But finally, those are the things that they respond to. And another thing that's worrying me is I feel that not learning with peers and, together, learning together, that is actually reducing the level of their understanding and their absorption. There are some cues that you pick up when you're learning with others that I think have been totally missing this past year or so. And now when we're starting to have them back and you can just see it happening, ideas are jumping from one brain to the other in a way that doesn't happen with this, hasn't happened so far. So I feel it even more.
Yeah, I always agree. If there's, so these are questions for Kamla, but if others want to add something to it, and yeah, this is more like a discussion. So yeah, please feel free to add wherever you would.
Yeah,
like.
so I want to ask.
Yeah, Pragya.
So the title of your book, it is addressed to whom? Is it to the students or is it to the teachers?
That's a nice question. Actually, I thought of it as to the teachers, because I felt I was writing to teachers. And I felt teachers had a lot of questions that were highly valid, interesting, deep questions actually. But no one takes our questions at that fundamental level, no? Even we don't take our questions so seriously. We don't realize how profound they are, how connected they are to some of the oldest philosophical debates. So I meant it for teachers, yeah.
Because we do tell our parents to ask the children what they asked in school today, because the power of questioning is really important, and asking the right questions and developing the skill of questioning for the children is a very vital skill.
Absolutely.
So we do tell the parents, ask the children what they asked at school today.
Nice. How nice.
What are some of the questions that you would love asking?
Me, myself? Well, I've shared all my questions out there. It's all in those 2 books. But maybe some more recent ones. If I am very curious to know, why is it that there's a general cognitive decline with online learning? I'm not able to understand the exact mechanism, but I see it happening. I see children who would have been, who would have picked up and been very alive and bright. Somehow they're missing important things, memories being affected. And I don't understand the mechanism by which I may say the same thing face to face and the same thing on a screen. They're reading the same material, but why is it not sticking? It's very interesting to me. It seems to have to do with multiple cues in one's environment. That's all I can think of, but or something emotional maybe, no? It may be an emotional, the brain needs to be in some kind of emotional state for learning to happen. And that happens when you are surrounded with your friends and your peers. And that's my big question. Why is this happening? What's the mechanism?
So since you teach psychology and you are a psychologist, with now slowly kids coming back to school,
yeah,
how do you, what advice would you give the teachers to use to support their collaborative and emotional well-being of the children? Because everything is in fragments now, and they've lost social skills, they've lost collaboration skills, and there are children who we know of a baby who's only 2 years and has not got used to seeing any strangers. So the child cries even if the child is taken out.
Yeah.
So how do you think we teachers should cope up with that?
Well, one thing that I've been doing even during the pandemic was trying to encourage collaborative learning. I had to think of ways it involved phone or even more screen perhaps, but we tried very hard to make small groups and pairs and have them and do little conference calls with 2-3 students at a time and a teacher and have that. So we tried to keep that up. But one good news is that now that they're back together, you can see that they very quickly are catching up. It doesn't seem to be that rusty as we thought. And if anything, I am, older people are more rusty. I'm a bit like, how do I do this? Where's my laptop? But the kids have just, it's as if they're in a different mode and the last 18 months are forgotten. It's nice.
That's good to know.
So Tarun has also asked, is it important to measure anything? And especially because we were discussing about measuring intelligence. So is it really important to measure things? Are there any other?
Yeah, so the only thing that I would measure is on an ongoing basis. Measurement is important. Evaluation is important. Have you understood this is a form of measurement? But the kind of summative measurement or the final static measurement that we are used to, we do end of year, end of term, and we state something. By the time we finish that measurement process and deliver the results, the organism has changed, no? So those kind of snapshot measurements are less and less useful. And it's the ongoing measurement that makes sense. And that measurement is both informative to me as a teacher and to the young person. Now, when you have to measure something to report to some other body, like an admissions board, or then it becomes, this whole high stakes testing. Until we can figure out more humane, broad-based ways of measuring a person's potential, this single score measurement is a real, it's the devil itself. What to do?
Ma'am, can I say something?
Yeah.
As you said, the single kind of measurement is not useful. There should be another one, the measurement should be how the child was earlier and how he is performing now. Like it's me versus me.
Well, that it's not. I didn't mean that actually, because some children may learn in spurts and then they may have plateaus. That's very natural, So to compare with one's past, or I think it's automatic that you know something you didn't know before. I would say evaluation and measurement would be, how can you think on your feet? I give you something, I give you a question. Let me see how you are thinking about it. I'll give you a little more guidance. Now see, how do you take that up and move with it? These are, there's some very nice exams, not exams, I don't know what they're called, assessments, oral assessments, or things that are, more dynamic, moving. How does a young person work with something new that you tell them? And then you can adjust for where they are also. It's much, but of course it's practically difficult to do, but that is what children deserve. Somebody asked, one second, there's an interesting question here. Yeah, I like this question. Can a great subject expert without the knowledge of child psychology? Definitely. I think so, for sure. I don't think you have to know a lot. My reason for, I'll tell you why. If you are a great subject expert in the sense that you love the subject, what do we mean by that? You don't have to be a professor of mathematics, but you love the subject. You have the humility to say, I am a learner and I have to keep learning my subject. And you will communicate that excitement and that spirit of learning, I feel. And then you should have some clarity of explanation. These are the things that are important. Now, my whole purpose in writing these books was not that to be a good teacher, you have to read these books A to Z, not at all. It is more to spark something in teachers of some kind of curiosity that, wow, I'm in a nice business. I'm in a very exciting business that's working with all these interesting questions and children, and just to give us a feeling of excitement in our vocation. Not that you have to know these things to become a good teacher, not at all.
why I asked this question, just to add more details. Like, for example, let's say there are 30 students in a classroom, and I am a great subject expert, let's say, and I am able to, let's say, involve 15 of those students. So, but 15 students are not involved. Okay.
Yes.
So I think that I am doing a good job because like I am able to handle those 15 students. I don't care if those 15 students are not interested in that. Let's say, I will just say that. So will that be a correct way to handle that?
No, of course not. And you know that, that's why you are asking me this. See, being a great subject expert is not, to me, synonymous with only being interested in the best students, or only, that is not equal for me. You can know and love your subject, but you have to be interested in reaching all the children in the class. That's a separate thing, no? It doesn't mean, maybe we have all had teachers who were brilliant and didn't care about those who didn't get it fast. That is true, but it's not necessary that way. You could be very good at your subject, but still be interested in, yeah, basically what I said, reaching everybody in the class. And then you will be curious, no? Why are these students finding it difficult? That curiosity may lead you to do some reading about it. You will investigate. You will find out more about those 15 who are not getting it, and like that it will go. That's you as a teacher, not as subject matter expert.
Yeah. So again, just a follow-up question. Like, I think that was a simple one probably to understand, but I think every teacher has this question nowadays about this online teaching. Like offline, we can still reach most of the students, but now online, most of the students are keeping their videos off. Then how should we reach to each and everyone, even if we want to reach? Is it even possible?
Yeah, this is a question that I feel there may be no good answer, and we can just hope and pray that schools will reopen soon, because it is hard to get them all. We have to keep reminding, keep requesting. Some homes don't have good internet. What about the thousands upon thousands of children without a device? This is a bad situation. I can't sugarcoat it and make it good in any way. It is bad. It's been bad, and I just hope we can get back to school soon, all of us.
May I say something about this situation?
Yes.
I think, that as you just said, that first of all, we have to make a distinction between being expert in a subject and being a good educator. So if we are clear about our role, that being a good educator does not mean that we are able to explain everything perfectly, but it means how to ignite the minds. Now, coming to the second point, during this pandemic, why they are not so effective? Because when we were physically in the class, many of us had perfected the art of bringing that excitement and igniting them in physical presence. But now we ourselves are not excited about teaching online, and we have to learn the art of selecting would excite the children. Use the digital material that's available, the videos, the things which challenge the students, tickle their mind. And because we are not excited, we are not able to communicate that passion, because after all, we are not communicating any knowledge. We have to communicate our passion. So we have it in us. What is it that communicate? So I think it's just time to come to grips with what is exciting online and what is not exciting. And many of us have not explored the power of digital material that's available.
Yeah, well, I would say that partly, but also I noticed for the first 6-8 months or so, the resistance to the mode was too much in me and in many of my colleagues. That blocked me from doing many things. And after that, when I gave up that resistance, I have enjoyed the online much more. I have been able to be more creative, not necessarily, to some extent using technology better. That was a big learning for me, but also understanding different modes of interaction through the screen. So getting the kids to sit further back so that they can move around more in that space, and requesting parents to, not use this, so that we could talk across a little distance. So they actually move, they have their things in front of them, they may do larger projects, little things like this. Yeah, it is better definitely than last year, the online, I'm saying.
Right. Actually, there's someone else who has asked, how can the teachers accelerate the child's learning to make up for the learning loss during the pandemic? So we did not discuss it today, but the book also talks a lot about this accelerating learning versus facilitating learning, which I really liked about. But yeah, over to you, Kamala.
Well, I think you're asking, how do we make up for lost time? Yeah, I wish that the whole world could have put pause and said, it's okay. We cannot keep on this train that, first standard, second standard, third standard, fourth standard. Give it a pause. I wish that we could have done that. Unfortunately, we feel that the children will lose a year, this whole notion of losing a year and so on. So we have to keep going. One of the things that wastes time in teaching is exams, testing exams. If we could put that on a little bit of a back seat, and in the coming year, just use more time in class to just teach. Forget about the testing and exams. That might be an interesting way to save, to gain some time. Maybe we have to have some longer hours. School could last a little longer every day. We'll all have to put a little more effort into it. That means we also work a little longer hours. It might have to be that way. And then, yeah, catching up may happen.
Yeah. So I had a question. You had mentioned something about students at a very early age being able to ask and answer why questions. So which was, I found very interesting, that where does this urge to find the causality come from? That why does this happen?
Sorry, I'm not able to hear you properly here. Can you say that?
Okay, Ashwin, can you take over? Just a minute, maybe there's some.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So Kamala, Mrinal was asking, you had mentioned in the book.
Say that. One sec, I'll turn off my video. Can you say it again? Sorry.
Yeah, Mrinal, can you ask the question? I think it should be fine.
So in the book, you talked about children at a very young age being able to ask and answer why questions. So, which I found very interesting, that where does this urge to understand the causality come from? Is it innate or, yeah?
Definitely. To understand that one word I got, where does the urge to? Causality. Yeah. Well, that's absolutely essential for survival, no? If you think about it, cause and effect, understanding causes and effects is what helps us manipulate the world and helps us navigate the world. If we don't have that kind of knowledge, it leaves us quite helpless. And so, in fact, that's true for many animals, but their range, the scope of their cause and effect events is very limited. My dog doesn't need to understand more than about 10 to 12 cause effect rules in his life. It's enough for him.
Right.
But for us, the scope of that is endless.
Right.
And we are born with an urge to figure out why, explanations, and then explanations in different categories, like explaining the behavior of physical objects, that's one, and explaining the behavior of living objects, that's a whole other thing.
Right.
Why did the ball move from this end to that end is a different kind of question than why did this dog move from this end to that end, right? So the nature of explanations is different, and we are born ready to understand those and categorize those in the right. It's quite beautiful. If you push the dog and it moves from this end to that end, a very young child can understand the difference between walking on its own intention and being pushed. Because it's a living object. It has an intention.
Right.
Yeah.
You also talked about motivation in the book, right? And it's something that all teachers struggle with a lot of times, especially in high school. And I would share from personal experience that how much ever I've tried many different ways, and it gets difficult to even the thing that you've talked about in intrinsic.
Yes.
changing the extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. So,
Yeah.
so any anecdotes that you have tried and something has worked, and
Yeah, for us, no, because in our school we don't do exams until school leaving certificate time.
Right.
Okay, so we do see a big difference in motivation to work at the time of that exam. It's a big joke. It's a standing joke at school that, okay, now you'll start working. But what we do see motivation for almost throughout is in the learning process. I see so many children who in class, they're totally there, 100% bright, engaged, alive, excited. I give work to do, homework, the motivation dips. And then I'm constantly struggling with that. I'm saying, look, you were so excited to learn this. Why can't you do the work? That gap, I think we have to understand that if they do it for you, for the teacher's sake. What is the purpose for doing work if there isn't an exam? If you put an exam in there, they'll do it for the exam. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? But while learning, the excitement of learning is definitely there because these brains want to understand, want to see patterns. They are excited. If there's a lot of difficulty and if the level of instruction is a bit too high, yeah, then there can be a drop in motivation. That definitely.
Yeah. Thanks, Kamala. So, is it okay if we extend the session for some 5 or 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Till 45 we can go.
Okay, so I had this question for you. In your book, both part 1 and part 2, you talk a lot about early childhood education. And now with the new national education policy, we have actually clubbed the kindergarten along with class 1 and 2. So it's going to be 5 plus something. What is your opinion on that? Do you think it's a good move?
Yeah, it all depends on how they're planning to train the adults who are going to be interacting with these children. Whether it's clubbed or not is not for me such a problem. It is how is the workforce going to be deployed, right? That I haven't seen or read any clear explanation of how they're going to do that. Training for early childhood education is very, very important. It's as important as training for high school. Though we don't believe it, we think, what is that? You know, you can do that with a 12th standard pass and 9-month course you can deal with, but that is not true. It's a very, very sophisticated ability to deal with very young children. That is really for me the important thing. Whether they are going to, how they are going to do that, and extending it till, like, I don't think of it as KG and first and second. I think of age groups. So, 5 to 10, that's fine. That's fine to look at it as one age group. It's not wrong per se. No? Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, yeah, I understand your answer. So, in fact, my follow-up question was kind of based on the sentence that you shared now. So, how much of what we know about this early childhood education, how much of it could actually be applied to adults also? For example, undergrads or even older people who want to learn a new skill. How much of this is applicable to adults?
Probably not too much, actually, Ashwin, because I feel early childhood, the brain is very different. The way it absorbs and the lack of general knowledge that it has, these two things will be very different from an older learner. And emotionally also, there'll be huge differences. So very young children are really not afraid to fail. They're not afraid to take a chance. That makes a huge difference. They're very confident, actually. Very young children, young learners, they rarely say, I don't know, I can't do. So, but at an older age, this is a huge block. Older learners we have to address their, this feeling or this stereotype that, oh, I'm past the age of learning. I'm too old to learn. Something wrong with me, then I'm still learning. These are huge differences which have to be respected. And I don't think that we can use the same principles.
Okay. Tarun has another question. So how do we handle the social and emotional aspects in early childhood as a teacher and also as a parent?
That's a very broad question. I wondered. I mean,
Yeah. So Tarun, maybe you can unmute and you can elaborate on the question that you wanted to ask.
Yeah. So for example, let's say if a child is playing and then there is a fight between all the friends and they start crying, or maybe let's say start shouting, fighting. So how to handle those kind of situations?
Okay. Interpersonal dynamics. Well, it's a bit of a dance, because on the one hand, if you interfere too much, social learning will be affected. And usually as an adult, I interfere because I have a very adult view of how those interactions should happen, right? There's a certain adult view of good manners, sharing, caring, cooperation. That is my view. And I am there, but children are not there. So to impose that to some extent is a mistake. You can let them sort it out. At the same time, you don't want there to be lasting damage or hurt, right? So when to intervene? So one thing that we do a lot, which is very nice, I think, is to allow free play, but be present. And then you watch yourself, actually. You watch the kind of reactions that come up in you. Oh no, how could she do that? How could he do that? But wait and watch. Intervene only when necessary. And that kind of free play and the way they sort out their dynamics is quite beautiful to watch. That is something I think we overparent, even as parents. It's also my embarrassment as a mother. Say thank you. What should you do? What you should share? It's my problem. We should see where our need to intervene is coming from.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful idea about observing them when they are free playing.
Yeah.
But my concern is that when we go as an observer, will that affect the dynamics?
Well, if we do it regularly enough, they don't care. They are not bothered. You're sitting in somewhere, you're reading your book. You can even be watching them. They forget about you after a while. They're very free. They play freely. I mean, it depends their relationship with you. If they're afraid of you as an authority for some reason, that might be dampened. But they get used to an affectionate adult's presence. They get used to it very quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you for answering.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I think you just mentioned that the art of when to intervene and how to intervene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
And we adults must know not only when to intervene, and we should know how to intervene. That's the that we are lacking.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
There arises the problem.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we come down a bit hard sometimes, very harsh, because we're coming from a moral code that's very adult. Whereas for the small child, it doesn't mean the same thing as it means to us.
So I had one more question. In your book, I noticed something very interesting, which I hadn't thought of before. You mentioned that the spatial ability that is not taught in schools, and for some reason, you feel that boys happen to have a better spatial awareness than girls, and this lack of teaching spatial skills in class manifests when they reach when they complete high school, and for some reason it affects their employment opportunities as well. So now I noticed that in the school textbooks, at least for maths, they are introducing spatial skills. I find new chapters which I didn't see when I was a kid. So do you think, I think that it's a good move, but have you actually seen the effects of introducing this? Has it kind of bridged the gender gap?
Not in a broad sense, but there have been specific studies that have shown that you can teach spatial skills, and that immediately improves performance on quite a broad range of tasks, which are somewhat mathematical, somewhat spatial. It does make a difference, definitely. But I don't know of any work done, at a societal level to see, is this making a difference already? Yeah, I have a lot of anecdotal evidence, but that doesn't really count.
Okay. Yeah.
Ma'am,
yeah.
sorry, ma'am, I'm surprised that when Ashwin said that girls have less spatial intelligence and boys have more. Can you exemplify? Can you give any examples?
So, see, it all starts from this very old and robust finding that you see more boys in higher levels of math, science, okay, in society. You see more of them taking up those courses. So then you wonder why. Okay, a large part of it is socialization. A large part of it is just a self-fulfilling prophecy that even if I'm very interested in physics, I look around me, I see it as a male domain, and I don't even realize I'm seeing it that way, and I don't choose to do it. Okay. But there is one other possible candidate reason, and that is that perhaps for some reason, girls are performing less well on certain spatial skills. It's very specific spatial skills like mental rotation and maze performance, certain specific things. And it's also known that if you teach those things, girls quickly catch up. So the idea is that perhaps we should actually deliberately include it in the curriculum, and that will bring both girls and boys to the same level. That's thinking behind that.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to add like another anecdote, there is this idea of different kinds of learners, that is visual learners, verbal learners, or kinesthetic learners. So I, for example, find that very counterintuitive. I always believe that it has more to do with the content rather than the way in which it's taught. For example, geometry, it's obviously it has to be visual. You cannot, it cannot be a verbal thing.
Exactly.
Right. So in your book, you mentioned this as a kind of hypothesis, and I think you did justice to all the different hypotheses. Apart from that, there was also this abstract, concrete classification, and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what would be your preferred hypothesis for the different kinds of learners?
No, it's exactly like you said, Ashwin. There are no different kinds of learners. This is a myth that's being perpetuated, but we really have to break it down. All there is there are certain subjects, topics, which are better suited to certain modes of learning. And then there are certain age groups that are better suited to certain modes of learning. Okay. And generally, when I'm as a teacher, I should use as many modes of teaching as I can. These three things we will accept. Beyond that, there is no way to typify a learner as this kind of learner, that kind of learner. And in fact, it does a disservice because it boxes that person into one kind of learning, which is not actually true. In fact, if you keep feeding one kind of mode, you will reach a block very soon. As you said, I can't go on teaching something I can't go on teaching geometry through a verbal method. It doesn't work. We have to bring in the spatial. Yeah. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I think we'll just have one final question maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, so you also mentioned about learning disabilities in your book. So you made like a very interesting observation that in the West and in US and Europe, there is this fear of over-diagnosis, that people are very quickly to diagnose a child as ADHD and give them some pills. But in India, it is under-diagnosed. Do you think awareness has increased in India also regarding learning difficulties?
It has in urban centers, definitely in the cities, perhaps even in the larger towns. But it is still not understood, I think, when you go to smaller towns and definitely in rural areas. The child who has a hyperactivity, who's high on the hyperactivity spectrum, is just considered a difficult child or a mischievous child or an impossible child. So that understanding hasn't yet gone, seeped in, I feel. But it is definitely better than it was. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, right. So I think it's time to wind up.
Yes.
So
can I say something, Ashwin?
Yeah, quickly, Geeta.
As you said earlier, girls are more interested in science and boys are more into spatial skills. I think I would like to add a point that in the olden days or still in many parts of in India, girls are confined to the homes because of the tradition. They are taught the self-help skills like cooking and all those things. That is all related to somehow related to science, kitchen science and
Okay.
all. And boys are given freedom to go out and explore the nature and to play with the pebbles and all. So
Okay.
I think that's the reason. Otherwise, there is not. In my opinion, there is nothing as
Yes.
boys have more special skills or girls have less special skills.
Yeah, there is something in our growing up, definitely. What exactly that is? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ashwin,
yeah.
Mrinal. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamla. Sorry,
Yeah.
my voice is
Yeah, thank you, Kamla, for joining us. And yeah, thanks for everyone for showing up for today's Teachers Corner. It was a very interesting session. And yeah, and thanks, Kamla, for the book and for joining us also.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
We hope to meet you
Bye
again
bye.
soon.
Hope to meet, hope to meet all of you someday. Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Right. So thanks, everyone. Teachers Corner is a monthly a gathering of teachers. So we will have the next Teachers Corner next month on the 3rd Tuesday, and we will share the link for the upcoming session soon. And meanwhile, we were actually sharing this on YouTube also. We were live streaming it on YouTube. It will be available on YouTube for you to see also. And yeah, we will also maybe upload the full recording soon on our YouTube channel. So yeah, thanks again for participating in today's discussion. I hope to see you all again in our next Teachers Corner. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much, Mrinal and Ashwin.
Thank you.
Thank you.